Tonight's event is called Café Philosophique, and I'm with the Newcastle Philosophy Society, and we help organize this thread of the Cafe Culture Northeast. Our speaker this evening is Daniel Kame. He's a senior lecturer in philosophy, and since 2 days ago, he's with the University of Lincoln, or which way around do they say it? Lincoln University or? University of Lincoln. And in fact, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche is in his core area of specialty. I'm not going to give you a blurb on his speech. I think that he can do that for himself. But just to give you a little bit of an idea of what the evening will look like. Daniel will be speaking for about half an hour. After that, we will be discussing, asking questions. After about another 20 minutes of that, we'll have a bit of a break, comfort break, chat amongst yourselves, and then we go back to discussions and questions, and we wrap up at 7:45. During the question and answer sessions, I'll be using a microphone for you to ask the questions with, and I'm going to be asking my friend Tony Ward to be the chair at that stage. So without further ado, one other thing. At the break point, we'll be passing around our donations bowl. So if you wanted to help support our podcasts and so on, we'd welcome your contributions. And I think that's it. Daniel.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Bringing philosophy to the general public is something close to my heart. I run a similar organization in Hull, and I'm in the process of trying to set up a philosophy society for the general public in Lincoln, where I've recently moved. And the topic of my talk this evening is going to be the trivial and inconsequential matter of the value of human existence. And I'm going to be focusing on this question, or considering the question, through the lens of the writings of two of the towering figures in the history of philosophy, the two great 19th century German thinkers, Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. Arthur Schopenhauer published his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, in 1818, a monumental work that covers topics in metaphysics, epistemology, aesthetics, and ethics. I'm not going to attempt to summarize the entirety of this work. I'm going to focus solely on one of its central doctrines, namely the doctrine of philosophical pessimism, which Schopenhauer is well known for. Now, the doctrine of Schopenhauerian pessimism can be summed up by the cheery thesis that it would be better for each of us never to have been born. And indeed, that the world as a whole is something whose existence we should deplore. Now, Schopenhauer reached this uplifting conclusion on the basis of a number of arguments, one of which concerns the nature of human willing or human desire. He argued that human existence is chiefly characterized by suffering. Now, he argued for this claim on the basis of an analysis of what it is to be a human being. Human beings, he argued, are characterized by a perpetual process of desire or striving. Now, he thought that striving or desire necessarily involves suffering. To be in a state of desire is necessarily, he thought, to be in a state of lack or deficiency with respect to the thing that you desire. Now, if desire or striving is what generally characterizes human existence, and if striving or desiring necessarily entails suffering, then he inferred, we can conclude that human existence is chiefly characterized by suffering. And to make matters worse, what happens when you get what you want? What happens when your desire is satisfied is nothing positive. What happens when you achieve the satisfaction of a desire is merely that the suffering that is necessarily caused by the process of desire is removed. So what we think of as pleasure or happiness is really just the cessation of suffering. It's really just the removal of the pain, which is the necessary concomitant of desire or striving. To make matters even worse, according to Schopenhauer, the suffering that is the necessary concomitant of desire is meaningless. It doesn't serve any overarching purpose in terms of which it might be redeemed. The universe as a whole is not striving towards any ultimate goal or purpose, and everything that happens within the universe is similarly futile or pointless. So all human suffering is, to capital, pointless suffering. Now, the starting point of Nietzsche's philosophy is essentially this Schopenhauerian thesis regarding the value of human existence. Schopenhauer had argued that human existence is chiefly characterized by suffering, and on that basis he infers that human existence is a dismal thing, that we'd be better off not existing. Now Nietzsche accepts the Schopenhauerian description of human existence as chiefly characterized by suffering. He accepts the Schopenhauerian theses regarding the sheer systematic, pervasive extent of suffering in human existence. He thinks Schopenhauer is right about that. But he seeks to resist the negative conclusion which Schopenhauer draws about the value of existence from the fact of the predominance of suffering. So Nietzsche, in effect, tries to separate out two distinct components in Schopenhauer's pessimism. Two distinct components which Schopenhauer sort of merges together. These two components are firstly a descriptive component, that is, a component that consists of various just descriptive claims about the nature of human existence, such as that it's chiefly characterized by suffering. And he seeks to distinguish this this descriptive component from an evaluative component. That is, the value judgment that life lacks value, that human existence is a dismal thing, which Schopenhauer infers from the descriptive claims regarding the predominance of suffering in human life. So there's a descriptive element of pessimism and there's an evaluative element of pessimism. And Schopenhauer had just assumed, without argument, that the evaluative conclusion regarding the value of existence follows from the descriptive claims regarding the predominance of suffering in human existence. And Nietzsche, I'm sort of reconstructing Nietzsche's position here. This isn't really explicit in Nietzsche's writings, but this is what I take to be the underlying logic of Nietzsche's approach. Nietzsche wants to separate out the descriptive component from the evaluative component and say, in effect, that the evaluative component doesn't necessarily follow from the descriptive claims about the predominance of suffering. In order to get the negative value judgment about life from the descriptive claim that suffering predominates in human existence, you need to plug that descriptive claim into some particular set of values, right? You need to be evaluating that purely descriptive fact by reference to a particular set of values. So Nietzsche thinks that were we to consider the fact of the predominance of suffering through the lens of some other set of values to those in terms of which Schopenhauer approaches the question, we might get a very different conclusion regarding the value of existence. So, in one sense, the entirety of Nietzsche's philosophy is concerned with supplanting traditional Judeo-Christian moral values, which in his view are what underpin Schopenhauer's pessimistic conclusion regarding the value of existence, with some alternative set of values in terms of which the fact of the predominance of suffering in human existence can be evaluated positively and can be embraced or affirmed. So Nietzsche's basic point is that you only get that negative evaluative conclusion regarding life from the fact of the predominance of suffering in human existence if you evaluate that fact, the fact of the predominance of suffering in human existence, through the lens of a particular set of values. And the particular set of values that he has in mind are the values of traditional Judeo-Christian morality. So Nietzsche says at one point that it was on the basis of the values of the unegoistic, that is, the values of Christianity, that Schopenhauer said no to life. Okay, so on what basis could Nietzsche be making this claim that it's only when evaluated through the lens of Christian morality that we get this negative, pessimistic verdict on life? Well, to understand Nietzsche's point here, we need to consider Nietzsche's more general view about the nature of Christian morality, which he has many very interesting things to say about. But one of the things that he wants to claim about Christian morality is that it is fundamentally hedonistic. That's not to say that, in Nietzsche's view, Christians are hedonistic in the sense in which we might understand that term today. It's not to say that Christians are, like to go out clubbing and engaging in that sort of activity. It's not that claim at all. The point is rather that questions of value, questions pertaining to the nature of good and evil, right and wrong, are, for traditional Christianity, to be settled in terms of hedonistic considerations, that is, considerations pertaining to pleasure and pain. And to make this point a little bit plausible, just consider the sorts of character traits or qualities of personality that Christianity has traditionally valorized as virtues. So I'm thinking of character traits such as compassion, pity, charity, altruism, selflessness, and so on. Now, each of these traditional Christian virtues is specifically concerned with the alleviation of suffering and the promotion of the well-being of others. So there's an underlying or implicit hedonism to Christian morality in that sense. Another consideration that I think makes Nietzsche's point about the underlying hedonism of Christianity somewhat plausible is if we consider the Christian conception of the afterlife. Now, the Christian conception of the afterlife is, well, first of all, the afterlife in Christianity is the highest good for human beings. It's the summum bonum for human beings. Human salvation consists in the achievement of a certain condition that's characterized by the complete absence of suffering. So there is no suffering in the afterlife. Now, if you accept those claims about Christian morality as implicitly hedonistic, then I'm sure you can see that were you to approach the question of the value of existence through the lens of Christian morality, then you would be led inexorably to a negative conclusion regarding the value of existence. If you accept, as Schopenhauer had argued, that suffering predominates in human existence, if you accept that, if you accept Schopenhauer's claims regarding the predominance of suffering in human existence, and you accept the underlying hedonism of the Christian moral perspective, that is to say, if you think that questions of value are to be settled by reference to hedonistic considerations, then you're going to be led inexorably to a negative verdict regarding the value of existence. Right? If suffering, basically, if suffering is bad, as Christianity implicitly teaches, according to Nietzsche's analysis, if suffering is bad and suffering predominates in human existence, you're going to be led to a negative conclusion regarding the value of existence. So that's the first point that Nietzsche wants to make regarding the connection between Schopenhauer's pessimism and traditional Christian morality. The second point he wants to make is that traditional Christian morality causes human beings to feel sinful. According to Nietzsche's analysis, Christian morality, or Christianity more generally, takes certain necessary and ineradicable features of human nature and then defines sinfulness or evil in terms of those necessary and ineradicable features of human nature. So to give you a couple of specific examples of that, in Nietzsche's view, Christianity is an inherently sadomasochistic morality. That's to say, it takes certain aspects of human nature and then defines sinfulness in terms of them, and thereby renders human beings essentially morally reprehensible and deserving of punishment. And in his view, it thereby satisfies or caters to an inherently sadomasochistic impulse in human personalities. So how does it do that? How does it satisfy this sadomasochistic impulse that Nietzsche postulates? Well, by taking certain core features of human nature and then defining sinfulness in terms of them. So, for example, it takes the human sexual drive, human aggressive impulses, and so on, and then defines sinfulness in terms of those impulses. So, on the Christian view, because our nature is sort of saturated with these impulses which it defines as sinful, on the Christian view, human beings are structurally or essentially oriented away from the good and away from virtue. And in Nietzsche's view, what that means for human beings is a profound and intensely burdensome awareness of our own essential moral failings, our essential moral reprehensibility. And the result is that feelings of guilt are profound and pervasive. Now, it's a very small step in Nietzsche's view from that kind of pervasive sense of one's own guilt or inadequacy to a generalized hatred of the conditions of finite embodied human existence. So there's a second connection between traditional Judeo-Christian morality and pessimism for Nietzsche. A third connection that he posits between pessimism and morality concerns the traditional Christian valuation of truth and truthfulness. As you know, on Christian morality, there is an absolute moral requirement on each of us, always and at all times, to be honest, both with others and with ourselves. Now, Nietzsche thinks that this has potentially very serious existential implications. Right? The requirement always to be honest with both others and ourselves, he thinks, conflicts with a basic precondition of human beings remaining functional, self-affirming, life-affirming agents. He thinks that we have an absolute need for falsehood and illusion, and that falsehood and illusion are necessary for life. He thinks that there are certain truths, certain existential truths about the human situation, which are sort of strictly intolerable for human beings, and that we require a kind of buffer in order to be able to remain functional, life-affirming, self-affirming agents. So there's a tension, in other words, for Nietzsche between the traditional moral requirement to be honest and truthful at all times, and this more general requirement, this more general precondition for the affirmation of life, which is that under certain conditions, human beings must have recourse to illusion and falsehood. We must evade certain truths, certain painful truths about the human existential predicament in order to be able to remain functional and life-affirming. Okay, so there are three considerations as to why Nietzsche thinks that Schopenhauer's pessimistic judgment about life is in some sense rooted in traditional Judeo-Christian morality. So his attempt to show how one can accept, on the one hand, Schopenhauer's descriptive claims about the predominance of suffering in human existence, and on the other, unconditionally or fully affirm life, consists primarily in an attempt to supplant traditional Christian moral values with some alternative set of values, in terms of which the Schopenhauerian description of the world can be evaluated positively. Okay, so I now want to say a few words about Nietzsche's attempt to do that, to supplant traditional Christian moral values with some alternative set of values. I'm going to say something about his position in his first published work, The Birth of Tragedy, which he published in 1872, in which he is explicitly concerned with repudiating Schopenhauer's pessimistic verdict on life. Basically, the approach that he takes in this work is to say that the Schopenhauerian description of the world, when evaluated by reference to traditional moral values, leads inexorably to a negative evaluative conclusion of life. But if we supplant those traditional Christian values with a set of values that are aesthetic, then we can be led to a positive conclusion regarding the value of existence. And he takes Greek tragedy. He takes Greek tragedy to, in effect, demonstrate the plausibility of this view. Because Greek tragedy, in Nietzsche's view, takes as its very subject matter the Schopenhauerian description of the world. So in Greek tragedy, we see catastrophic, appalling events befalling individuals who are undeserving of the immense suffering that they have to endure. So Greek tragedy, in effect, depicts the Schopenhauerian pessimistic insight about the pervasive extent of suffering in the world. And it also depicts this suffering, correctly in Nietzsche's view, as occurring not in accordance with any kind of general moral principles. The suffering that befalls Oedipus, for example, is not deserved suffering. Suffering in Greek tragedy is meted out on an unmerited basis. So it also depicts the general truth of the amoral nature of the world. Suffering isn't meted out on a merited basis. And yet, despite its subject matter, tragedy, in Nietzsche's view, can elicit an affirmative response to these general facts about the human condition. So Nietzsche wants to say, in effect, that we recognize in the fate of the tragic hero, we recognize in the fate of Oedipus our own fate. So Oedipus is, in effect, a symbol of humanity. We recognize that Oedipus's fate is, in some sense, our own fate. And yet, nevertheless, we take pleasure in the tragic spectacle. So what tragedy demonstrates, according to Nietzsche, is that the truths that constitute the descriptive components of Schopenhauer's pessimism, while when evaluated in moral terms, must be deplored, when evaluated in aesthetic terms, can be shown to be the bearers of positive aesthetic value. So Nietzsche thinks that by viewing the world, by viewing the human existential situation, as it were, through the lens of tragedy, and evaluating it in accordance with the kinds of values which are embodied by Greek tragedy, we can be led to a position which, on the one hand, acknowledges the basic truths of the Schopenhauerian description of the world, and yet, on the other, fully affirms or welcomes those aspects of human existence. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.